Welcome to the CBIA BizCast. I'm your host, Ali Warshavsky, and today on our podcast, we're speaking with Ryan McGurk of RSM. RSM is an audit, tax, and consulting firm and a sponsor of our Manufacturing Summit on October 29th at the Marriott in Trumbull. Ryan is here to tell us what RSM is hearing from manufacturers and a taste of what our 2021 Manufacturing Report revealed. So Ryan, welcome to the podcast.
Hey, thank you for having me. Good afternoon. Happy to be here.
Well, first of all, for anyone who doesn't know, Ryan, explain what is RSM and how do you work with manufacturers in Connecticut?
Sure. So as you mentioned, RSM, we are a leading provider of audit, tax, consulting, focused on the middle market. So we're the fifth largest firm in the U.S. And, our vision is to be that first choice advisor to the middle market and the middle market leaders. So that's kind of our niche, to work with those companies in that market space. And we've developed a pretty good strategy and ability to do that with those, companies and individuals, particularly manufacturing as well. The firm itself, we have about 13,000 people across the U.S. And about 2,400 in the Northeast and about a little over 300 in Connecticut, serving all sorts of industries, but particularly the manufacturing industry. Yeah,
well, thanks for explaining that, because you have worked with us last year as well, and possibly in years since way before my time on this manufacturing summit. In the past year and a half, coming up on two since the pandemic began, have certainly been probably the most challenging for manufacturers. Did you see a lot of them relying on PPP loans to survive this time?
Yeah, I would say there was a good majority that went after the PPP loan and received the funding. Some of our clients that maybe didn't, either because they were fortunate enough to have liquidity or access to capital, either through existing lines of credit or, their ownership structure. But there was a far majority that did actually take out the PPP loan. So very happy to have them. Some of their biggest concerns at the very onset of the pandemic was, not only keeping the lights on, but a lot of our manufacturers that we see and we work with care a lot about their people, and how did they keep, there was a lot of uncertainty to keeping the people and their payroll, meeting payroll costs. So those PPP loans went a long way towards kind of fulfilling, or mitigating some of that risk for them.
Yeah, because a lot of them, I think, and you can correct me if I'm wrong here, had to keep their factories open, right? I mean, they're still manufacturing, but they couldn't keep the same amount of people in. So there's probably days where some of their employees actually couldn't come into the office or the plant or wherever, the factory, because of COVID restrictions. And yet the company probably still wanted to keep them on payroll because even though they can't be in there, it's not like they didn't want to, just a spacing issue at some point.
A lot of companies had to pivot very quickly. So whether it was maybe opening a third shift or figuring out how did they practice and develop social distancing, which in the past was not a concept, right? Especially on a manufacturing floor where you might have to work very closely with other members of the production team or operations. So it was taking those considerations in. How do you get, no pun intended, but PPP, personal protection, for, their employees, and still, keep in mind what their ultimate business goals are to produce a high quality product for their end customers. So there was a lot of juggling that. And I think the PPP loans was very helpful. And we saw a lot of the funds that they received, if not all, used towards kind of that, that motive.
Yeah, part of it was, at least in the beginning, is part of it had to be used for company payroll, and other parts could be used for other things. Certainly keeping people employed in Connecticut was a great thing to see companies do during the pandemic. But our manufacturing report showed 88% of manufacturers reported difficulty finding and retaining workers, and 41% call the labor shortage the main obstacle to growth. What have you been hearing? Have you been hearing they're really having trouble rebuilding their workforce or finding skilled employees here in Connecticut?
Yeah, and I think this is well documented in a lot of channels in the media too. There's obviously a labor shortage for especially talented the workforce, right? So a lot of our clients and our manufacturers, that is a real struggle, the shifting workforce dynamics. And I think that those dynamics in the workforce shifted very quickly, with the pandemic. So we see a lot of our, clients and their leadership at clients asking, how do we attract, talent, obviously, to keep up with our organization and sustain growth? How do we adjust to what, this new dynamic workforce in the marketplace is looking for? A lot of people have reconsidered what's important for them to themselves as their individuals and their families. So how do companies reassess kind of their value proposition to the workforce, their employees, but also prospective employees? And, it's certainly a challenge. And I think, like I said before, I think it was a challenge that came accelerated very quickly during the pandemic, if that makes sense.
Yeah, and part of our manufacturing report, it seemed to show that one of the issues is competitive wages and the cost of living in Connecticut. Did you see or hear from manufacturers that they had to increase their hourly wage or salaries to try to attract more talent?
Yeah, and obviously that's the first thing you could think about too. What's important to people: competitive salaries, their wages. Obviously you move on to what else can we do from a benefit standpoint. But I think some of the other aspects that our clients and manufacturers, in the state are thinking about, and across the, the Northeast and the country too, is, what else outside of the compensation is important to people. People want to feel involved, and they want to work for companies that are innovative and adapting to technology and so forth. So, individuals are adapting to new technologies every day in their personal lives. They want to go to work and experience that kind of evolution too. So I think it's important that the manufacturers continue to evolve. And what else can we do? Obviously it's going to benefit attracting workforce, but there's obviously dividends to the production and efficiencies and so forth, just from, thinking about that value proposition outside of just compensation, but, the greater holistic needs of their employees. So.
Yeah, I think the pandemic brought quality of life to the forefront of a lot of people's minds, but it's definitely tough with manufacturing, with something that people can't really work remote some days or most days of the week. So something they're certainly going to have to figure out as the workplace continues to evolve. And I know we mentioned a lot of negatives, trying to find the workforce and possibly offering higher wages and the high cost of living in Connecticut being a problem, but it looks like our survey or our report revealed that over half of the businesses that we surveyed seem to be growing, and only 12% forecast a decrease. So it does seem like overall there's some optimism about growth of manufacturing in Connecticut.
Yeah, certainly. And we hit on the struggles of the workforce, which is obviously key to driving, growth. But some of the manufacturers benefited, as we mentioned earlier, kind of being deemed kind of essential businesses, whether they're in certain industries and sectors, maybe aerospace, which is big here in Connecticut. But a lot of them are considering, hey, we're struggling in the workforce. How do we, meet our long-term strategic growth goals, especially from an organic standpoint and not just from an acquisitive standpoint. So they're adopting technologies, as I mentioned before. They're looking towards automation and potential, Internet of Things enabled devices in their manufacturing facility. How can we use, technology and the data that's on our production floor? How can we harness that in a more efficient manner? And I think as companies continue to do that, that's going to drive profitability and growth. So that's kind of, where we see a lot of, exciting kind of changes. It's not just show up, punch the clock, and, let's make something. It's like, how can we adapt and gather additional information and data that's maybe always there, but we just never had access to, to help us understand our problems in real time. And, I think that's some of the edge that companies are looking for and hoping to take advantage of to drive that growth.
Yeah, and just streamlining processes, right? Looking into ways to do that. And one way I think manufacturers are really concentrating on streamlining or figuring out another way is that supply chain. You can't turn on the TV and watch the news or open a newspaper and not see supply chain shortage in one of the headlines. Is that something that you're hearing from manufacturers that they're dealing with and trying to find solutions to right now?
Yeah, and this goes back, like you said, it's all over the news, whether it's the ports and things are stuck in shipping containers, or even if you just think globally overseas, there's workforce and constraint issues, over in Asia on just getting these things onto boats. So that's obviously led to a big increase in lead time in, whether it's raw materials for our manufacturing clients or even just capital equipment that they need to kind of keep up with their expected growth. And so that's been a big burden. And it's how do companies reassess, the resiliency of their supply chain? How do they get more kind of insight into, what's causing lead time, problems, and how do we risk assess that and process that and then, mitigate that? So we're seeing a lot of that, and it goes everywhere, just from local labor too in the US on truck drivers. There's a shortage of truck drivers, so freight's increasing, and all these rising costs that manufacturers are either absorbing or trying to figure out, can they even pass this on to their end customer at that point? So it's certainly a challenge to couple with the workforce that we spoke with earlier. So.
Yeah, there's just that. When I was speaking with TD Bank, who has been working with them to secure their PPP loans, and will also, who will also be speaking at our manufacturing summit, they mentioned that, the pandemic was one hill to get over, but now since things are going virtual, cyber fraud is something that manufacturers have to worry about, supply chain issues and the labor shortage. I know that we've heard from some of our member companies that they are looking at the bigger ones partnering with other bigger companies to partner with their supply chain issues. So maybe load up the same truck, two companies pitching in to load up the same truck, and others relying on 3D printing to print their supply chain. So maybe that's a little bit of what we call manufacturing 4.0. I know you mentioned that before. So let's go into, what is that? Is that the future with 3D printers and different types of materials to help the supply chain?
Yeah, and it's a much more holistic, it's a much more holistic kind of strategic change that, companies are looking to, evolve into a manufacturing 4.0 world. There's no end date. Hey, we're going to meet the end of this project and we're manufacturing 4.0. It is kind of a cross organization, value proposition that's perpetually ongoing. So, it's something that uses advanced technologies, allows manufacturers to kind of reimagine their operations, right? And that's, not just the operations floor, but it's the finance, their technology, supply chain, reimagining supply chain, also finding what tools, automation and connection can they find and use that data that's in your manufacturing supply chain and customer data, and analyze that to be more prescriptive at the end of the day, right? Right now, people look at data on the back end. It's descriptive to describe what happened. It's finding ways to then be diagnostic with the data, predictive, and then prescriptive, right? So using that data to get ahead of the challenges and, strategize from a, short-term, but also long-term kind of, organizational initiative.
Which is why we're seeing all those Internet of Things labs or IoT labs pop up, correct? They're the ones looking for how do we prevent your refrigerator from not working before it doesn't work? Exactly.
Yeah, I would love to. Yeah, I got to make sure my refrigerator doesn't go because we all have that problem. That's a great example. Great way to put it in your personal life example. Right?
Things I'm worried about, clearly food, right? And making sure my refrigerator works. But my last question for you, Ryan, is, where do manufacturers go from here? What is their main focus, do you think, going into just short term, really 2022?
Yeah, I think, the biggest thing right now, we talked about the supply chain. So, how do they continue to optimize supply chain? Dual sourcing, Do they find suppliers or vendors that are closer to them, mitigate some of the, lag time, lead time, continuing to modernize and leverage technology, maybe less short term, but more investment too in technology, learning, prescriptive AI, help companies leverage analytics, scenario planning, forecast planning, stuff like that. And then we've also talked about the workforce. That's obviously very key. And, how do we get talent in our building, whether it's the manufacturing, operations, finance, accounting, HR, it's all interconnected, right? And how do we change that value proposition for our workforce to get them to want to come in and be excited for, evolving and pushing the enterprise, our clients' visions forward. So we're seeing a lot of that. So difficult times, but exciting times too, because I think a lot of the technology that's out there, when we see companies be successful and ride out the storm, as we've seen a lot of our clients, it's been very rewarding to kind of sit side by side with them and see them through that process. So.
Well, Ryan, thank you so much for joining us, and we look forward to seeing you in person at our Manufacturing Summit, October 29th at the Trumbull Marriott. You can register for the summit at CBIA.com, and thank you for listening to the BizCast. Subscribe on Apple, on SoundCloud, and of course, you can also listen to more episodes at CBIA.com.